So last week on episode 81, I talked about the various podcast types and choosing the right one for your brand. When you choose the right podcast type for your brand, it means that you're building podcast content that helps you work towards the brand goals that you've established. That episode was an extension of episode 80, where I talked about defining your podcast why. And when you clearly define your podcast why, you know exactly what you're working towards. So it will help you choose the right podcast type, and it will determine how you build out that content going forward. In last week's episode, I also talked about, as one of the types, your traditional approach to podcasting. And the big one that most folks lean into when they're building a podcast is a solo approach or a guest-driven approach. And that leads to this week's question that I want to pose to you and, of course, answer as we go through today's episode. Does having a guest on your podcast negatively impact your overall results? There's many layers to that, much like choosing the right type of podcast. So as we dig into this today, stick with me because this is going to make sense, because that question on the surface, you may be thinking, wait, why would I not want to have guests on my show? Isn't that what podcasting is all about? Yes and no. So let's dig into that. Hello, my name is Jason Sircone, and you have stumbled upon episode 82 of Podcasting Strategy Simplified. So as I said, bringing guests on your show, that seems like status quo for podcasting, right? When you think of the shows that sucked you into podcasting as a consumer, more than likely, in some way, shape, or form, they had a guest dynamic in place, meaning there was a host, or there was multiple hosts, or there was a guest or multiple guests. One way or another, it was lots of different people, or maybe just two people, carrying on a conversation. And the more engrossing that conversation was, the more engaged you got. That, of course, led you to check out what else is in the catalog. And then if they did a good job, you got engrossed by that content as well. So podcasting at its core, in my opinion, has been built around storytelling. And the best versions of storytelling are the ones that keep us captivated. And that's not just limited to podcasting. You think of anything that you consume, whether it's movies, documentaries, television shows, books. If there's a good story in place, you're going to want to stick with it so you can see what happens at the end. It's following that hero's journey. It's learning something along the way. It's getting engrossed in what's happening within that story and falling in love with certain characters. There's so many elements to it, and it applies to podcasting in such a big way. But what I find myself thinking about more and more these days, as I am now, I don't want to say fully entrenched in a solo-based podcast, but you've probably noticed as this show has unfolded since I rebranded to the new name, I've leaned into mostly solo content. And that was 100% intentional. And that's really what I want to dig into today, because on a lot of levels, because we are so accustomed to seeing podcasts built with guests, we can often get hypnotized. And I know I used that word in the last two episodes. We get hypnotized by what we see and therefore think that's how we have to follow suit. That's how we have to carry out our podcast as well, because everybody else is doing it this way. And if we look at them as a successful show, well, we want that too. So, of course, we have to mirror what they're doing. But what I encourage you to do is to look at it from your own lens and look at what you want to accomplish. And again, I talked about this on last week's episode 81, but I felt like I wanted to give it more time and give it the respect it deserves, because when you really think about this, when you're developing your podcasting strategy, if you're not thinking about what you want to accomplish and ultimately where you want your show to position you as the thought leader in your space, you may make the wrong decision and put yourself in a position to where, even if you're enjoying the act of podcasting, your show is just not doing enough for you. And I want to help you avoid that at all costs, because any time and effort that you pour into podcasting should serve you. It should serve your brand. It should serve your goals. It should help you develop a skill set that allows you to not only build more engaging content as you continue to build out your show, but you also develop a skill set that you can transfer to other areas of your personal and professional life. And believe it or not, that may be way deeper than what you've thought about when it comes to picking a podcast type or just starting a podcast. But that's what I like to do here. I want you to be informed. So as you make these decisions, they are setting you up for long-term success. And they're keeping you engaged in the process of building your podcast for a long period of time. I saw a great tweet from the great Adam Shobley. And Adam, I'm sorry. I follow you on Threads. We talk all the time. And if I'm pronouncing your name wrong, I apologize. I believe I said that right. But if you're not following Podcasting Business School on Threads, please do so. But he had a great thread or a great post the other day that talked about how long it took him to get to a certain point. And I believe he had classified it as hitting the 1 million download mark. Now, for many of us, that may seem like it's so far off. And I'm very real. I know that it is. However, I am here for the journey. I'm not just trying to hit that number. I'm all about what happens along the way. And you should be as well. But what he put below that was the real sticking point in that whole post was, do you know who's not going to hit the 1 million episode mark? It's all those people that have quit after 10 episodes. We fall into that trap far too often. And I know I've spoken about this before, but for whatever reason, there's this weird stigma that surrounds podcasting that results are easy to come by. Or for some reason, even worse than that, they're instantaneous. Not the case. Podcasting is a long game. Podcasting allows you to develop something that once it's built, it's never done. There's the old line from The Social Network about fashion is never finished. I 100% believe that podcasting is never finished because you're constantly finding new ways to develop your story, to communicate with your audience, to take topics that you've talked about before and put new spins on them. Perhaps there's new innovations in your industry that you want to put another spin on or take another angle with. There's so many different ways that you can plot out this content, but in doing so, you are building something that's going to put you on the map as a resource that people can turn to. It positions you as that authority, but maybe even unbeknownst to you as you do that, you are developing a skill set that allows you to do other things in your world. And if you pick the right type of podcast and the right type of method to develop your content, it's only going to make you better at a particular skill set. I'm going to get to that in a moment so it'll make more sense. But overall, to answer this question of whether a guest negatively impacts your podcast, let's talk about how it potentially could. Now, if you go back to last week's episode, I had made the comment that depending on what you want to achieve, you need your audience to view you as that person, as that resource. If you are setting yourself up to be someone that facilitates great conversations, you want to grow your platform, you want to grow your network, you want to increase your expertise, and your way of doing that is to connect with other leaders in your industry, bring them on your podcast, and have an engrossing, engaging conversation. There's absolutely nothing wrong with that, and many podcasts are built that way. But in a lot of cases, the people that are hosting the podcast want to be viewed or seen as that resource themselves. And when you bring new voices into the room, yes, those voices can add credibility to your podcast. Yes, it's going to allow you to engage with someone that's like-minded and really dig deep into those topics. But by definition, you're dividing the audience, and it's up to the audience to decide who are they going to pay the most attention to. And in most cases, people tune into podcasts, they're listening to somebody speak. They are trusting you to bring on powerful voices. As they listen to those voices, there's that trigger that goes off in their mind that says, this guest is the authority I should be paying attention to. So again, if your podcast is formatted for that, then you have no problem. But if you come into this saying, I want to be the authority, I want to be the resource, I want to be the number one person in this industry, you absolutely should not be featuring guests on your podcast. if anything, if you are featuring guests on your podcast, you really have to look at the ratio of content that you're producing of solo versus guest driven. I've said this on many episodes here. I do plan on bringing more guests here onto Podcasting Strategy Simplified because I'm very interested in you getting the very best information about podcasting strategy. And that's not always going to come from my mouth, but 90% of the time, I want it to come from my mouth. So given that number, I'm looking at usually eight to 9 episodes where it's just you and I going one-on-one, much like we're doing today. I love solo content. I love doing solo podcasting. At the same time, I love having conversations where I can connect with other podcasters, other podcast strategists, other professionals that are leveraging this platform in a powerful way, because I know they can bring expertise and knowledge that's going to help you grow. So the more that you tune in to listen to what I have to say, every now and then you're going to get some other perspectives. And I like to keep those conversations wide open and organic because for me, that's the enjoyable part. Depending on how you're building out your podcast, a lot of folks like to do this with a lot of questions lined up before the episode begins. So then they go into it, they know they're going to have enough to carry on a conversation that lasts 30 minutes, 45 minutes, whatever arbitrary time window they have on their podcast. They want to make sure that they have enough content to talk about. In my years of podcasting, what I've discovered is that I'm able to carry on a conversation organically, and I don't need to bring questions. Now, I'm not saying that you have to do it that way. That's just how I prefer to do it. But I'm looking beyond all of that and looking more at what I want to accomplish with my podcast. And my podcast is designed more to be like a coaching tool versus something that's constantly driven by conversation. So as you tune into new content of Podcasting Strategy Simplified, you're going to get coached, you're going to get consulted, you're going to get information that helps you build out your podcasting strategy. Should you want to take that to the next level and work one-on-one with me, there are ways that you can connect with me to make that happen. But if this podcast is serving your needs and helping move the needle, then you've got this resource at your disposal. And I am committed to continuing to add content to the catalog that helps you grow in that respect. So for me, having a guest on all the time would be a negative result because it's not going to allow me to communicate with you the way that I want to. And it's ultimately not going to lead to the results that I want to achieve for my brand. And this is why it's incredibly important to think about what you're doing with your podcast and how you want it to serve your brand. Now, I know this just from having coached people and just from random conversations that I've had at events or online. And I will say, I know this from my own personal experience that solo podcasting at the very beginning can be a little intimidating. So I want to break that down for a few minutes so you understand that it doesn't need to be. We put so much pressure on ourselves in this space, and it's very, very unnecessary pressure. When I think of the very first solo podcast I ever did, this was on my first beer podcast that was known as Over a Couple of Beers, over 10 years ago at this point. I remember sitting down at my kitchen table. I did not have a studio set up. I didn't have video at the time. I was just recording this straight into Audacity. And I wrote down a shit ton of notes, way more than I needed. And it was a learning experience to say the least. But what I still think about and I laugh about to this day is I recorded that episode. I didn't put a timestamp on it. I just said, I need to figure out how this works in a solo environment. And I want to roll and just see what happens. And I remember I got probably about 20-ish minutes in. And for whatever reason, because I had had a few beers as I was drinking or as I was doing the episode. So it was a beer podcast. That's what I did. We were reviewing beers, talking about beers, yada, yada, yada. But I could not get this line right. I don't remember the line. And clearly at that point in time, I couldn't remember it either. But I just could not get it right. And no matter how many times I tried to say it and get it right, I couldn't get it. And instead of just stopping and saying, let's think of something different to say, you can fix all of this later, I stopped and deleted the whole recording. And I like I said, I look back on that today. I'm like, what the hell were you thinking, man? Like the first 20 some minutes weren't bad. They were what they were, but it didn't mean that I had to delete the whole thing because I couldn't get one line right. That's where my head was in regards to solo podcasting. So looking back on my former green podcasting self over 10 years ago, I can say the pressure I had on myself was that I was trying to create perfection. And as the Great Tin Cup says, perfection is unattainable. And it's not even that perfection is unattainable. It's unnecessary. It's unneeded. It doesn't need to be 100% polished. The idea is that you are delivering a message that resonates with your listeners, and listeners are going to be attracted to authenticity. If you are trying to do something that is 100% scripted and sounds 100% perfect, it's not going to get over as well as something that is from the heart, and it may have a little bit of a flub to it here and there. And even going as far as what I was thinking with my show back then, I don't know why I felt like I needed to be perfect. It was a friggin' beer podcast. Some of the shows that we put out were not even close to perfect. A couple of the shows that we put out should have never even been put out. That's a story for another day. But overall, I think back to that, and one of the biggest lessons that I took away from that first solo session was that I don't have to be perfect. I don't have to put so much pressure on myself. So that's my words of encouragement to you today, that if you're thinking about starting a podcast and you want to position yourself as that resource, as that go-to person in your industry, but you're concerned that your message is not going to come across in a solo format, don't think that way. And understand that you need to develop your skill set. And the only way to do that is to turn on the microphone and turn on the camera and tell your story. Bring your message to life. Let things unfold over time. Will your first episode be perfect? Hell no. Will your 100th episode be perfect? Probably not, but that's okay. There are levels of skill that you're going to feel yourself getting to. And for me, I don't like to toot my own horn, and I leave everything open to you as my consumer to say, maybe this guy thinks too much of himself, but I feel like I've gotten very good at doing this solo content. I love coming to you one-on-one and just speaking to the camera. Was it awkward at first? It was a little awkward, no doubt. It took me time to get to a point where I felt comfortable. But the more practice and the more reps I put in and the more content I produced in this fashion, the better I got at it. And I realized the value that came from this because I was able to be that resource. I was able to create content that was very repurposable, and I could use this in a number of different ways. And I saved myself time by not having to constantly reach out to guests. And I'm going to get to that in a moment as well. So your solo content does not need to be made from a position of fear. You want to make sure that you are setting yourself up to tell your story and develop your skill set at delivering that story the more you move forward. So going back to Adam's comment from before, how do you not get good at this? You quit. You stop doing it. You abandon it and go a different direction. It takes time to bring a skill set to life, but the more time you put into it, the more thoughtful you are with how you build out this content, the better it's going to be. So you don't want to commit this from a position of fear, and you don't want to make it so time consuming that it becomes a burden and it becomes an anchor. How can you make solo content time consuming? Script out the whole damn thing. I've made this mistake in the past too. And when you are reading a script, don't get me wrong, there are ways that you can do it and you can sound like you are not reading a script. But it's incredibly time consuming to do that to yourself, to write out word for word, even with the help of ChatGPT or Claude. It may give you something that you can use, but for one, I would never, ever recommend reading something that produces without massaging it and making it your own. But I'm going to put an X through that because I would never recommend doing that anyway. If you are going to come to the microphone and do a solo podcast, have some bullet points in front of you. You would be surprised how much you know about the topic at hand. And a lot of times it gets built up in our mind that we want to talk about something, but we're not going to be able to think of points in the moment. But almost across the board, as I've worked with podcasters, anytime that I usually this is usually like a 1 episode thing. Let's do the first episode and see how this goes. I let them go and they go way longer than they ever thought they could. And then when they get done, they say, holy crap, I really had a lot more to say about this than I thought. And that's the exercise that I let it roll because I want them to prove it to themselves that they know their shit. And you know your shit. So you don't have to script out every word you want to say. You just want to have bullet points of the most important items that you want to make sure you cover. And I'm not saying don't practice. You can look at those bullet points and do some exercises in the mirror or do a quick mock recording. Get the thoughts out of your head and figure out the best way to organize them. Or you can just do what I do and I talk. And for me, it's all unscripted. Every now and then, I'll take a step backwards. There are times when I know I want to have more of a format to come to the mic with, so I will have my bullet points. But today, as I put this episode together, I knew what I wanted to talk about. And here we are almost a half an hour into this episode. And this has been all from the heart, all off the cuff. Because for one, I've prepared the last 2 episodes and I knew how I wanted those to go. And this was an extension of those. But also, this is from years of working with people and helping in the coaching space or just doing this on my own and developing my own skill set. So there's many ways that you can think about this. But the 2 things that you want to make sure that you're keeping front of mind is to not be scared of going solo or not taking all the time in the world to create an episode, because those are the things that would make you feel like it's not the right way to go. And then if that's what you decide, there's 1 or 2 things that could happen. A, you quit, which we don't want you to do at all. We want you to stick with this. Or B, you lean into a podcast format or a podcast type that doesn't serve your brand goals. So now, because the solo content didn't take off the way you wanted, or you're just scared to do it, now you're leaning into the guest-driven content. And now, yeah, you have a podcast, but is it truly serving your brand? Probably not. I believe in the mix. And the mix is, again, going to be determined on what your goals are. So you may have a weekly podcast and 3 of your episodes on any given month are solo. They're built around your mission. They're built around your story. They're built around driving people to the next step in what you want them to do in the journey. And then the 4th episode can be a guest-driven conversation where you have that guest come on, they tell their story, you rap back and forth about the information and the topic at hand that you're both clearly passionate about, and then you build your catalog out that way. So depending on what you want to accomplish with your podcast, that's going to determine whether a guest is a negative or a positive for your overall production flow. One last thing I want to talk about when it comes to guests on your show, and I mentioned this before, it's more work. And by more work, it's a double-edged sword. In the act of creating the podcast, it's less work because now you have somebody else that can carry the conversation with you. It's not all on you to carry the content like it is in a solo format. But there's much more work that goes into the beginning phases of the podcast or of the actual building of that episode than many folks realize. I was actually just on a call as I sit and record this. I was on a strategy call with one of my clients, and we were talking about the work that goes in to bringing those guests and aligning the schedule so everything falls into place. That can be difficult. It's not just snapping your fingers and saying, hey, I've got this podcast. I've got this open time slot. I'd love to have you on. Do you want to join me? And the guest saying, sure, let's do it. I'm open that time. I get like sometimes that'll happen, but the guest has a life too. They have other things to accomplish in their day. If they happen to be open at the time that you're open for your podcast, great, it's kismet. But most of the time, you've got to work to find time. And I will say, if you're going to do that, if you're going to bring on guests, try to build your own schedule and stick to that versus letting it be wide open for the guest to choose any time that works for them. That is a surefire way to burn yourself out. If you are constantly having to record every day of the week at different times of the day, because that's when guests are available, that's hard. Believe me, that will catch up with you. And eventually you're going to be pissed off that you've got 5 recordings this week and they're all at different times on different days. You got one on Monday at 10 a.m. and then the next one is Tuesday at 7 p.m. And then the next one is Wednesday at 4 a.m. Man, if you're doing that, more power to you. But the point I'm driving at is that you need to pick a day or maybe 2 days that are your recording days and block that time accordingly. So maybe you have a 2 to 3 hour window on Monday in the morning, and then you have a 2 to 3 hour window in the afternoon. And that's where you can schedule your guests. Now that time is blocked on your schedule, so you know that you can set that aside, and that's when you're going to be recording your podcast content. And based on when you want that guest to schedule, you give them a few options on those days, but just stick to those days. And then when it fits their schedule, they can pick the time slot that works. That's going to save you a lot of stress and aggravation in the long run. But going back to the main point of this, when you are featuring guests on your podcast, it is going to elevate the amount of work that you have to perform. You have to think about all of these items, from scheduling the guest and then preparing what you want to talk with that guest about, to actually doing the interview itself, to creating additional assets, to continuing the communication with that guest. And that's something I firmly believe in. The stronger the communication is along the way and after the fact, meaning after you record, that's going to really set the table for the relationship that you build with that guest. And really what it comes down to when you bring guests on a show, in my opinion, and I believe this 1000%, it's how much meat can you get off that bone. You should be looking at it from the content creation perspective. You should be looking at it from the relationship building perspective. You should be looking at it from the networking perspective. How can you build a relationship with that person that goes beyond just the 30 to 45 minutes that you took to make a podcast episode, and hopefully form something that's going to be mutually beneficial? You want to be able to reach out to that person if you have someone you can refer them. Likewise, you want to have a relationship to where they feel they can do the same, whether it's someone that could actually use your product or service or would be a great guest for you. I've built relationships with people because I had such a great rapport through the interview that one time, this only happened once, but it was a magnificent experience. The gentleman we got done recording. He said, "This was phenomenal. I've got 5 people that I want to share with you right now that you need to contact. I think they'd be great guests for your show." So I was instantly working smarter, not harder, because I took time to build that relationship. That's a lot of work. Is it worthwhile work? Yes, it is. But I'm going back to the theme. What do you want to accomplish? How do you want your podcast to serve your brand? If having guests on your show is going to do that, then make it happen. But if you really want to establish yourself as that authority, solo content should have more of a presence on your podcast catalog or in your podcast catalog than your guest-driven content. So I'll wrap up by answering the question one last time. Does having guests negatively impact your podcast? It absolutely can. But it really comes down to what you want to accomplish and how you are positioning your content. And if you want to take on that extra work, then you're absolutely welcome to do so. But think about your goals, think about how you want to be perceived, and think about where you want your brand to be in a year, in 2 years, in 5 years. What type of podcast is going to get you there? The solo-based, where it's your expertise always shining through on the microphone, or that guest-driven content that does allow you to have great conversations and still flex your pipes and still flex your expertise, but requires a little bit more work and a little bit more planning. You're going to be able to make that decision in the early going. And this is why I always recommend starting off with that mix in the beginning. Do solo content, do some guest-driven content, see what makes the most sense for you. But the earliest question I would ask is, what do I want to accomplish with my podcast? If it's to position yourself as a thought leader, you've answered the question. Go solo-based over guest-driven. If you want to network, if you want to build rapport with others in your industry, in your niche, look at the guest side of things. It can go both ways. But if you have a clear-cut goal of being the resource, of being the number one person that people turn to in your industry, I will say that having guests will absolutely negatively impact your podcast. So keep that in mind and make sure that you are going the right direction so your results bear fruit in a much more efficient fashion. And with that, we're going to bring the curtain down on episode 82 of Podcasting Strategy Simplified. I hope you had a great time, because I know I did. Until our paths cross again on the next episode, my name is Jason Sircone, reminding you that podcasting isn't easy, but it doesn't need to be complicated. I'll see you next time.